250 years ago, 13 scattered colonies clinging to the edge of a vast and unmapped continent made a declaration that would echo through the centuries. Today, that declaration has grown into a nation of 330 million people, stretching from the frozen edge of the Arctic to the sun-baked sands of the desert Southwest, from the rocky shoulders of the Atlantic to the volcanic shores of the Pacific. This is America at 250, not just a story of monuments and speeches, but a story written into the land itself, into every mountain range, every river, every creature that calls this country home. Because long before there was a flag, there was a landscape. And that landscape is still writing the story of who we are. To understand America, you have to understand its restlessness. No other nation on Earth holds this much. Variety within a single set of borders. Glaciers grind down granite peaks in Alaska, while 4,000 miles south, the sun turns sand into an inferno in Death Valley. Thunderheads, twice the height of Everest, boil up over the wheat fields of Kansas, while gentle fog drifts through thousand-year-old forests on the California coast. This country was never meant to be simple. It was built from difference, stitched together from every kind of ground imaginable, and that same restless diversity that shaped the land also shaped the people who settled it, fought for it, and still call it home. Our story begins where the nation itself began, the Atlantic seaboard, where rocky shorelines and hardwood forests once greeted the first colonists stepping off wooden ships. This is a land of hard winters and stubborn granite, of maple trees that blaze red and gold each autumn as if the whole coastline is celebrating a homecoming. It's fitting that a people who would go on to declare independence from an empire first had to learn to survive New England's brutal cold, because from the very beginning, resilience was baked into the American character. The animals here know something about endurance, too. White-tailed deer browse through frost-hardened meadows. Wild turkeys, nearly hunted to extinction a century ago, have clawed their way back into these same forests, where colonial farmers once found them by the thousands. It's one of American wildlife's great comeback stories, a reminder that even after near total loss, recovery is possible. Head south along that same coastline, and the hardwood forests give way to salt marsh and cypress swamp, the true wild heart of the Southeast. Here, an ancient reptile has outlived empires, revolutions, and every human government that has ever tried to tame this land. The American alligator has patrolled these wetlands for tens of millions of years, a living fossil with armored skin and a bite force that can crush bone. She hunts with the patience of geology itself, motionless for hours, waiting for an unlucky deer or wild hog to wander too close to the water's edge. It's a strange thought, but this alligator's ancestors were already ruling these swamps when the first English ships arrived at Jamestown. Long before the nation had a name, this land had a rhythm, and the rhythm hasn't stopped since. Move inland and upward, and you climb into the ancient folds of the Appalachian Mountains, some of the oldest peaks on the planet, worn smooth by hundreds of millions of years of wind and rain. These gentle, forested ridgelines rolled out a welcome mat for settlers pushing west in the decades after independence was declared, and they remain one of the most biodiverse, temperate forests anywhere on Earth. Black bears amble through rhododendron thickets, salamanders no bigger. Then a finger thrive in more variety here than almost anywhere else on the globe. And in spring, the forest floor erupts into a carpet of wildflowers so dense that early botanists described it as walking through a living quilt. It was through gaps in these very mountains that the young republic first pushed its borders westward, chasing the promise of open land and a bigger future. That push west eventually met the Mississippi River, the great artery of the continent, and beyond it, the endless grasslands of the American heartland. The prairie is deceptively simple to the eye, grass to the horizon in every direction. But look closer, and it's one of the most dramatic stages on the continent, a meeting ground for weather systems colliding from every direction with nothing to slow them down. It is here, over these open plains, that the United States generates more tornadoes than anywhere else on the planet, sometimes over 1,000 a year, touching down across what meteorologists call Tornado Alley. Bison once thundered across these grasslands in herds so vast that early explorers described the ground itself trembling. Hunted to the edge of extinction in the 19th century, fewer than 1,000 bison remained by the 1880s. Today, thanks to a century of dedicated conservation, hundreds of thousands roam protected lands and private ranches once again, a hooved symbol of a nation that came dangerously close to losing something irreplaceable and chose, instead, to bring it back. Beneath the prairie grass, another American icon builds an entire underground civilization. The black-tailed prairie dog digs sprawling burrow towns that can stretch for miles, complete with distinct chambers for nurseries, food storage, and listening posts. Their alarm calls are so sophisticated that biologists have identified different chirps for different predators, essentially a working vocabulary broadcast across the grassland. When a supercell thunderstorm boils overhead and spins a tornado down onto the plains, most surface animals scatter and run. The prairie dog just heads underground, weathers it out, and starts rebuilding within the hour. It's easy to overlook something so small next to bison and grizzly bears, but the prairie dog embodies a very American kind of resilience. Get knocked down, dig in, and get back to work by morning. Keep heading west, and the land begins to rise sharply. The Rocky Mountains erupt from the plains like a wall thrown up against the sky, snow-capped peaks running unbroken from New Mexico all the way to the Canadian border. These mountains hold some of the last true wilderness in the lower 48, places where wolves, mountain lions, and grizzly bears still move through forests largely unchanged since before the Declaration was signed. Elk gather here by the thousands each autumn, and their bugling calls, an eerie, bright, whistling roar, echo off canyon walls in a ritual that predates any human settlement on this continent. The Rockies also hold the headwaters of some of the nation's greatest rivers, water that will eventually reach both the Pacific and the Gulf of Mexico, splitting at a single line called the Continental Divide. It's a fitting metaphor for a country that has always had to reconcile two different destinies, Atlantic and Pacific, East and West, tradition and reinvention, and somehow keep flowing forward as one. South and west of the Rockies lies a completely different kind of America, one defined not by abundance, but by scarcity. The desert Southwest is the hottest, driest corner of the continent, home to Death Valley, where summer ground temperatures can exceed 200 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cook an egg on the sand within minutes. And yet, even here, life refuses to give up. Ants that store liquid food and swollen abdomens the size of grapes act as living pantries for their entire colony, buffering their nest against months without rain. Roadrunners, immortalized in cartoons but every bit as clever in real life, dash across the sand hunting rattlesnakes and scorpions with a speed that can outrun a human sprinter. And carved through the heart of this arid world is the single most breathtaking scar on the American landscape. The Grand Canyon, nearly 300 miles long and over a mile deep. A layered timeline of nearly 2 billion years of Earth's history exposed in solid rock. Mountain lions still stalk its rims today, elusive and largely unseen, proof that even in a landscape this harsh, apex predators still find a way to thrive. The Pacific coastline offers yet another face of America entirely, one shaped by fog, cold currents, and the endless rhythm of the tides. Just offshore from some of the busiest cities in the country, pods of dolphins numbering in the thousands hunt cooperatively through swirling schools of anchovies, using coordinated tactics that would put any human sports team to shame. Sea otters float on their backs in beds of towering kelp, cracking open shellfish with rocks balanced on their bellies, one of the very few animals on Earth known to use tools this way. And gray whales migrate along the same coast every year, mothers guiding newborn calves on a 6,000-mile journey from the warm lagoons of Mexico to the food-rich waters of the Arctic, the longest migration of any mammal on the planet. It is humbling to remember that some of these same waters, once hunted nearly to silence, are now home to whale populations that have rebounded significantly since protections were put in place, a quiet victory that unfolds every single year just beyond the surf line of some of the most crowded beaches in the country. Further north, the Pacific Northwest holds a forest unlike anything else on Earth. Coastal redwoods rise more than 300 feet into the fog, the tallest living things on the planet, some of them already centuries old when the first colonial governments were being formed on the other coast. These trees drink fog directly through their needles, pulling moisture from the coastal mist in a slow, ancient partnership with the ocean climate that sustains them. Beneath their canopy, a different kind of architect is quietly reshaping entire mountainsides. Beavers, working in family groups, can build dozens of feet of dam in a single day, transforming fast-running streams into slow, rich wetlands that support hundreds of other species. After the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980 scoured an area the size of a major city into gray ash and broken timber, it was beavers, of all animals, who moved into the wreckage first, damming the meltwater and beginning the slow work of turning devastation back into wetland paradise. Few animals better capture the quiet, stubborn optimism of American rebuilding. And each autumn, all along this northern coastline, one of the great natural spectacles on the continent takes place. Millions of salmon leave the open ocean and fight their way back upstream, sometimes hundreds of miles, guided by nothing but the memory of the exact patch of gravel where they themselves once hatched. Grizzly bears wait at the rivers. Sea lions crowd the river mouths. Eagles gather by the thousands along ice-free stretches of water. It's a chaotic, brutal, beautiful competition for survival. And yet, the salmon runs are so massive that the vast majority make it through, and the ones who don't still give something back. Their bodies decompose along the riverbanks, feeding the very forests that will shelter the next generation. It's one of nature's purest lessons in legacy. Even in death, contribute to what comes next. North of all of this, past even the northern edge of the lower 48, lies the last true frontier of American wilderness, Alaska. Here, Wolf packs range across territory larger than entire states, hunting musk oxen whose ancestors survived the last. Ice Age and whose thick underwool remains one of the warmest natural fibers known to science. Brown bears gather by the dozens along saltwater shorelines each autumn to gorge on stranded whale carcasses, setting aside their usual solitary, territorial instincts, because survival through the brutal Alaskan winter depends on packing on tens of thousands of calories, while the opportunity lasts. And atop it all sits Denali, the tallest peak in North America, so cold at its summit that it rivals conditions found near the poles. This is a landscape that offers no mercy and demands total adaptation. And yet life not only survives here, it thrives, generation after generation, in one of the harshest environments on the continent. Between the eastern seaboard and the heartland lies another world entirely, one carved not by rivers, but by ice. The Great Lakes hold roughly a fifth of all the fresh surface water on the planet, an inland sea so vast that early explorers genuinely mistook parts of it for the ocean. 10,000 years ago, retreating glaciers gouged these basins out of solid bedrock, leaving behind cliffs of layered sandstone, sweeping dune fields taller than 10-story buildings, and forests that turn into some of the most dazzling color displays on the continent every autumn. Wolves still roam the remote wooded islands, scattered across Lake Superior, forming some of the most closely studied predator-prey relationships in the world. A decades-long natural experiment in balance that scientists continue to follow to this day. It is a landscape that shaped the fur trade, the shipping routes, and the industrial cities that would eventually rise along these shores, cities that 250 years later are still finding new ways to reinvent themselves. Further south, where the Appalachians finally surrender to the coastal plain, the land flattens into the vast subtropical wilderness of the Everglades, a slow-moving river of grass unlike anything else in the country. Here, apex predators from two completely different corners of the natural world now share the same territory, as pythons introduced through the exotic pet trade compete with native alligators for dominance in the marsh. It's a strange, uniquely modern collision, a reminder that this land is still being shaped, for better and for worse, by the choices of the people living on it. Wading birds by the tens of thousands, herons, egrets, and roseate spoonbills still nest here in numbers that recall descriptions written by naturalists centuries ago. Proof that even a landscape under constant pressure can hold on to something of its original character if given the chance. Off the southeastern tip of the country, barrier islands of white sand curve along the coastline like a protective arm, absorbing the force of hurricanes before they ever reach the mainland. Sea turtles have been hauling themselves up these same beaches to lay their eggs for longer than there have been humans anywhere on this continent. And every summer, hatchlings no bigger than the palm of a hand make their instinctive, perilous crawl toward moonlit surf, guided by little more than the reflection of light on water. Conservationists now patrol these same beaches at night, shielding nests from raccoons, ghost crabs, and artificial light, a very modern form of stewardship applied to one of the oldest survival rituals on Earth. 2,000 miles out into the Pacific, an entirely different piece of the American story rises straight up out of the ocean floor. The Hawaiian Islands are the visible tips of volcanoes still actively building new land, one of the only places on the planet where you can watch fresh earth being created in real time as lava meets the sea and hardens into black rock. Native honey creepers, brilliantly colored songbirds found nowhere else on Earth, evolved here into dozens of specialized forms, each shaped to fit a particular flower or insect, a living demonstration of evolution working in fast motion on an isolated chain of islands. It's easy to forget, looking at a map centered on the continental United States, that the country's story also includes tropical rainforest, coral reef, and the descendants of Polynesian navigators who reached these islands in double-hulled canoes long before any European ship charted this ocean. America, at 250, is, among everything else, a Pacific nation as much as an Atlantic one. Back on the mainland, in the arid grasslands and canyon country of the interior West, the story of American conservation was essentially invented. It was here, in places like Yellowstone, that the idea of a national park, land set aside permanently for the public rather than sold off for private gain, was first put into practice anywhere in the world, decades before most. Other nations even considered the concept. Wolves were hunted out of this same landscape by the 1920s, only to be deliberately reintroduced 70 years later in one of the most closely watched wildlife experiments in modern history. Their return reshaped the entire ecosystem from the ground up, thinning overgrazed elk herds, allowing willow and aspen groves to recover along riverbanks, and even changing the course of streams as vegetation took root again along the banks. It remains one of the clearest examples anywhere on Earth of how removing or restoring a single species can ripple through an entire landscape. And it happened within the borders of the very first national park the world had ever seen. It would be easy to tell this story only through wilderness untouched by people, but that would miss something essential about America at 250. This is also a story of cities built at the edge of wild places, and of wildlife that has learned to share those edges with millions of human neighbors. In the heart of one of the largest cities in the country, in a park surrounded by freeways and film studios, a mountain lion once made international headlines simply by surviving. He had crossed one of the busiest highways in America on foot, carved out a territory a fraction of the size any wild mountain lion would normally need, and lived for years within sight of a world-famous illuminated sign, becoming something of a local legend before his story ended. His journey captured something many Americans quietly recognize in themselves: the instinct to adapt, to find a foothold no matter how crowded or unlikely the circumstances, and to keep going. That same instinct to adapt and endure runs through the story of the bald eagle, the bird chosen as the new nation's emblem in the earliest days of the Republic. By the middle of the 20th century, pesticide contamination and habitat loss had pushed the bald eagle to the edge of extinction within the United States, with only a few hundred nesting pairs left in the lower states. It looked, for a time, as though the nation's own symbol might not survive to see its country's next major anniversary. But a combination of legal protection, habitat restoration, and the banning of the chemicals responsible for their decline allowed the species to recover in a way that few conservationists dared to predict. Today, tens of thousands of bald eagles nest across the country, and in places like the river valleys of Alaska, thousands gather each winter along ice-free stretches of water in one of the largest gatherings of eagles found anywhere in the world. Few stories capture the arc of American environmental history better, a symbol nearly lost, and then, through deliberate effort, restored. It isn't only the charismatic animals that tell this story. Along the Gulf Coast, in the vast wetlands of Louisiana, one of the largest swamp ecosystems in North America continues to filter water, absorb storm surge, and nurse fish populations that support fishing communities up and down the coast, work that has been happening quietly for thousands of years and continues largely unnoticed by anyone who doesn't live nearby. Out in the honeypot ant colonies of the desert, workers gorge themselves on nectar during rare rainy seasons, swelling their abdomens to the size of grapes, effectively becoming living storage tanks that the rest of the colony can feed from during the long droughts that inevitably follow. When food runs desperately short, colonies have even been known to raid each other's nests, stealing stockpiled nectar in swift, coordinated attacks before retreating just ahead of incoming desert storms. These smaller dramas rarely make headlines, but they are unfolding by the millions across the country every single day, each one a tiny lesson in preparation, patience, and survival. There's a reason nature documentaries about this country so often reach for the word hero. It isn't just marketing. It reflects something true about how this landscape works. Every species living within these borders, from the smallest oak toad in a Florida hammock to the largest blue whale off the California coast, has had to develop its own specific form of courage, cunning, or endurance simply to exist here. The nation itself was founded on a similar premise, that ordinary people, given the right conditions and enough determination, could build something enduring out of uncertainty. 250 years later, that premise is still being tested, generation after generation, in courtrooms and classrooms, in city councils and county fairs, in the quiet daily work of people showing up for their communities, the same way a mother caribou keeps pushing her calf toward the safety of the herd. South of the plains, where the grasslands finally give way to scrubland and coastal prairie, the landscape tells yet another version of the American story, one written in cattle trails, oil derricks, and some of the largest bat colonies on the planet. Each spring, tens of millions of Mexican free-tailed bats gather in a handful of Texas caves to raise their young, forming one of the largest concentrations of mammals found anywhere on Earth. At dusk, the colony pours out of the cave mouth in a living river that can take hours to fully empty, headed out to consume hundreds of tons of insects in a single night. A natural form of pest control that quietly saves regional agriculture untold amounts of money every growing season. It's a spectacle most people will never see up close, unfolding in the dark, far from any highway. And yet, it is every bit as essential to the balance of this land as anything happening in a national park. As the nation reaches this milestone, the celebrations taking shape across the country are almost as varied as the landscape itself. In Washington, tall ships are gathering for naval reviews along the same waters once patrolled by a fledgling colonial navy. On the National Mall, fairgrounds and exhibitions are drawing visitors to reflect on 2.5 centuries of the American experiment, while museums, from the Smithsonian's network of institutions to small regional historical societies, are opening exhibits exploring both the triumphs and the unfinished work of the nation's history. Commemorative coins, bearing the dates 1776 and 2026, are already circulating in pockets and cash registers nationwide. Communities in all 50 states, along with Puerto Rico, are hosting block parties, concerts, and shared meals meant to bring neighbors together in a single, simple act of celebration. Millions of Americans have pledged volunteer hours as part of a nationwide service initiative, restoring trails, mentoring students, and supporting veterans, treating the anniversary less as a single day of fireworks and more as a year-long invitation to give something back to the country being celebrated. As the nation marks this milestone year, communities everywhere are finding their own ways to reflect on that quarter-millennium journey. Small towns are hosting parades that wind past courthouses older than most countries on Earth. Volunteers are logging millions of hours of community service, from restoring hiking trails through old-growth forests to mentoring the next generation in cities far from any wilderness at all. Students across the country have been asked a simple but surprisingly difficult question. What does America mean to you? The answers vary as widely as the landscape itself, shaped by region, background, and personal history, but a common thread runs through nearly all of them. A belief that this country, imperfect and unfinished as it has always been, is still worth showing up for. 250 years ago, a handful of colonies bet everything on the idea that a new kind of nation could be built from scratch, stitched together from very different peoples and very different landscapes into something durable enough to last. It was, in its own way, exactly as improbable as a 3-ounce hummingbird building a nest, raising twins, and teaching them to fly, all in the space of 5 short weeks before the desert heat becomes unbearable. It was exactly as improbable as a squirrel losing an entire winter's food supply overnight and simply starting over by morning. It was exactly as improbable as a species being pushed to the very edge of extinction and clawing its way back to the skies within a single human lifetime. And yet, here we are, 250 years later, still here, still adapting, still occasionally colliding and correcting course, the way weather systems collide over an open prairie and somehow, eventually, clear. This is the story that this land has been quietly telling since long before anyone here spoke of independence. It is written in ancient rings of coastal redwood trunks. It is written in the migratory paths of gray whales who have swum the same coastline for longer than human memory. It is written in canyon walls that record nearly 2 billion years of change, a timeline that dwarfs any single nation's history, but somehow makes it feel more remarkable, not less, that a country could rise here at all. Every mountain range, every desert basin, every river delta on this continent has its own version of resilience, built into its geology and its wildlife. And for 250 years, the people living among them have been writing their own chapter into that same deep and ongoing story. The map of this nation doesn't end at the mainland's edge or even at Hawaii's shores. Puerto Rico's rainforest mountains hold a species of tiny tree frog whose piercing 2-note call is so central to island identity that it has become an unofficial anthem, sung nowhere else on Earth. Coral reefs off the Virgin Islands host some of the most colorful fish communities, under American jurisdiction anywhere in the world, and remote Pacific atolls thousands of miles from any major city still fall within the reach of the same flag flown over state houses from Maine to California. These territories rarely make it into the popular image of the country, yet millions of Americans call them home, and their landscapes, tropical, volcanic, coral-fringed, are every bit as much a part of this nation's ecological inheritance as the deserts and mountain ranges more commonly pictured when people imagine America. 250 years in, the full geography of this country is still, for many, a work in progress of discovery. None of this land tells its full story without the people who have walked across it. Long before any ship reached these shores, hundreds of distinct indigenous nations had already spent thousands of years learning the particular rhythms of this continent, understanding which rivers flooded, which forests could be burned to encourage new growth, which animals to follow through the seasons. That knowledge still shapes how much of this land is managed today, from controlled burns in western forests to fishing rights along Pacific rivers. In the centuries since, wave after wave of newcomers has arrived on these shores for wildly different reasons, some seeking opportunity, some fleeing hardship. Many brought here against their will and forced to build a future out of circumstances they never chose. Out of all of it, an unlikely and still unfinished nation took shape, one that has had to keep renegotiating, generation after generation, what its founding words actually mean in practice. That renegotiation is not a footnote to the American story. It is the story, running in parallel, with every mountain range and migration route already described, a human landscape every bit as varied and every bit as resilient as the physical one. There is no single symbol big enough to capture all of that. Not the eagle circling a river valley in Alaska, not the bison grazing where their ancestors nearly vanished, not the mountain lion navigating a city of 10 million people, not the small-town parade marching past a 200-year-old courthouse. It takes all of it together, the whole sprawling, contradictory, breathtaking patchwork, stitched from polar ice caps to baking desert and everything in between, to even begin to describe what this country actually is. 250 years in, the experiment is still running. The landscape is still shifting. The animals are still adapting. And somewhere out there tonight, in a swamp, on a prairie, high in a mountain range, or in a city park beneath a glowing skyline, another small act of survival, another quiet act of resilience is already underway, adding one more thread to a story that is nowhere close to finished. That is the story of this land and of the people who have called it home for 250 years and counting. Not a story of perfection, but a story of persistence. Not a finished monument, but a living, breathing, endlessly adapting landscape, still writing itself into the future, one generation, one migration, one mountain, one sunrise at a time. Welcome to America, 250 years young, and still, in every sense of the word, wild.